At the conclusion of the Apology, Socrates leaves us with a cryptic quote. So in this translation, the hour of departure has arrived, and we go our separate ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better? God only knows. This line and other features of Socrates' behavior and his arguments throughout the Apology lead me to believe that his acquittal was not at least the primary goal that Socrates went to court with. And the description of his behavior, the account he gives of his own behavior throughout his life, and the behavior he exhibits on the stand, if you will, are very abnormal. So in this video, I want to zoom in on Socrates' goals in the Apology and his conception of virtue. So there are two questions that I want to use to guide this talk. How are Socrates' conceptions of the following virtues different than the common conception? So these virtues: justice, wisdom, piety, and citizenship. And the other question I want to look at is, how does Socrates exemplify these virtues in his life and in his act of speaking as he is when defending himself? So first, let's go to the first question. How are Socrates' conceptions of the following virtues different than the common conception? First, justice. What's the common conception of justice? So a common conception of justice is the process or result of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes and criminals. So whatever a court might rule, some view of justice might be that's what justice is. That's not the only conception of justice, but that's at least a conception of justice. Socrates seems to have a different one. Wisdom. A common conception of wisdom seems to be knowing stuff and having like street smarts, like knowing how to apply it. Socrates, I'll claim, I think exhibits that he has a very different idea of wisdom than what the common conception was of his fellow Athenian citizens. Piety. If we say somebody's pious, we usually mean something like they're reverent or respectful. They have the appropriate attitude towards the gods, and it can even mean something like unquestioning devotion. So looking at some more definitions here. So piety, the quality of being religious and reverent. It can even be unthinking, conventional reverence when taken to the extreme. And wisdom, having experience, knowledge, good judgment, applying, especially with regard to applying experience and knowledge and judgment. So that's where I get these ideas of the common conception. And then citizenship. Maybe a common conception of citizenship is getting along well with others and keeping up with the traditions of your society. And Socrates, I'm going to say, has a very different idea of what citizenship entails. So to start getting a feel for what he thinks about these virtues, I want to look at the story he tells about his friend who went to the oracle at Delphi, and the friend goes and asks, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle replies, no one is wiser than Socrates. So Socrates, upon hearing this, is confused. He thinks he has no such wisdom, and there are many people who claim to be wise, and so he goes around and like interrogates them to see if they might be wiser than he is, and see if the God's word is true or not. So he asked the politicians, he asked the poets, he asked the craftsmen, And in each case, he finds that they claim to have knowledge that they don't really have. So especially in the case of politicians, they claim to know all sorts of stuff. They fool people into believing that they know all sorts of stuff. But upon closer examination, Socrates finds they don't know anything. The poets, they can create great works of art, but ask them about the works of art, according to Socrates, and they will give you a worse account than people who really like that, the poems or the art. I think of like songs that I love and artists that are asked about them, and I think, oh, this artist is really gonna like get into all these connections that I saw in their art. And sometimes it's as banal as like, I had a weird dream one night, and I'm like, oh no, let me explain this, there's all this cool stuff about it, right? So Socrates says they must have some sort of divine inspiration. Then when it comes to craftsmen and artisans, they're very good at their craft, but Socrates, after conversing with them, finds that their knowledge of their craft leads them to overestimate knowledge in other affairs, like what virtue is, or what being a good citizen is, or what justice is. And Socrates says, well, what would be better, to have that sort of knowledge and make claim and think that you have more knowledge than you have, or be in Socrates' position where he admits that he has no sort of wisdom, that he has no knowledge, he knows what he doesn't know, right? And he says it's better to be in his position than in that of the craftsman. So in each case, Socrates finds people who claim to possess a certain kind of knowledge that they actually don't. So the truth of the oracle, or the God's words, Socrates says, is that no one is wiser than him, because he's aware of his ignorance. He knows what he doesn't know, and he has no pretensions to knowledge beyond what he actually knows. So what conception of piety and wisdom can we draw from this story? Well, it's a weird, remember, Socrates is on trial for being impious, right? It's a weird story to tell, that a god told your friend something, and your friend told you, and you didn't believe it. And so you went to ruthlessly interrogate everybody to see if the god was speaking the truth to you. Right? That's not the sort of person we would normally call pious. But it turns out that Socrates' origin story tells us that his mission, he takes to be a divine mission from the god, but what it is to ruthlessly interrogate the world to see if the god's word is correct. That's a, I guess, unique, or at least revisionary version of piety, if it's even piety at all, and that's sort of an open question, right? So it's certainly not reverence or unquestioning devotion for Socrates, it's ruthless interrogation of God's words. And what about wisdom? Well, the idea of wisdom that Socrates puts forward is not knowing stuff and like street smarts. Instead, it's knowing the extent of your knowledge. Knowing that earthly knowledge doesn't amount to much. And knowing what's important to pursue. And this brings, and what's not important, right? Importantly. So then we get to Socrates' idea of justice. So what laws and the court's rule. Socrates, throughout the dialogue, talks about how one of the things that marks him as different from other people is his different list of priorities. So justice, it seems, and he also talks about how the courts can make a mistake, and he thinks they're making a mistake if they put him to death. So his view of justice won't be just what laws and courts happen to rule according to law. It seems to be something more like, which is also another definition of justice, accurate appraisal. Like accurately seeing the world for what it is. So what about this final virtue, the virtue of citizenship? Socrates has a revisionary view of citizenship, I want to claim as well. So in his comparison of himself to a gadfly, Socrates paints this picture that he does the city a great service by harassing them, by getting them to examine their ideas and thereby be more certain of their ideas and not to be like have the city be corrupted. So what is Socrates' view of citizenship? It's that a citizen should be constantly questioning the ideas and practices of their society. And that can get annoying if you do it as much as Socrates does, right? All right, so these ideas of virtue that Socrates has, they're very to slightly different than common conceptions. So then how does Socrates, and this is one thing that impresses me every time I read this, how Socrates lives his creed, right? At least in his account. But how he lives according to his values. So how does he exemplify these virtues in his life and in his acts of speaking as he is? Well, one thing he does talk about consistently throughout the Apology is that it is cowardly, unwise, and arrogant to fear death. So why would it be arrogant? He says, well, it's arrogant to think that you know what death brings. So it's also unwise because it's almost like you're claiming to have knowledge that you don't have. And we should fear that which is bad for us, but we're not sure if death will be a bad thing for us, as strange as that is to say, right? So how does Socrates live that? Well, he fought in a war. He talks about an act of civil disobedience which might have led to his death when he was ordered to bring somebody in who he didn't think should be brought in, and returned home. But lucky for Socrates, the regime was toppled before he was killed for that civil disobedience. And then another thing I want to draw our attention to is his courtroom behavior. So Socrates, I want to say, scantily and poorly at times addresses the charges being brought against him. In our other video, we talked about his argument against the charge that he's corrupting the youth. And I wanted to say it's a pretty good argument, but it's certainly not uncontroversially good. Remember, his claim relied on the fact that nobody risks harm to oneself, and that premise seemed a little shaky, right? But his other argument against corrupting the youth seems to be a straight-up ad hominem attack on Meletus. So he says, look, Meletus doesn't know anything about corrupting the youth. What conclusion are we to draw from that? That Socrates is not corrupting the youth, or just that Meletus doesn't know what kind of charge he's bringing against Socrates? If Socrates' primary focus was his own acquittal, this would be a pretty bad argument, right? This ad hominem attack, which is a straight-up fallacy against Meletus. And against the charge that he makes the weaker argument into the stronger, there are also some problems with that argument. So Socrates equates this to being that he's a kind of sophist. But if we're to take the charge, if we're to take his argument against the charge, and Socrates clearly wants to differentiate himself from sophists and philosophy from sophistry. But sophistry is, again, like a sort of rhetoric, right? Like teaching people how to win arguments. And Socrates is like, I don't teach people just how to win arguments. I teach people how to seek the truth. But his argument is that if he was the kind of person who made the weaker argument into the stronger, he'd be accepting money for that. He doesn't accept money. Therefore, I guess he's not a sophist, because sophists accept money. But does this show us definitively that he doesn't make the weaker argument into the stronger? Not so much. So why do I think he's giving these arguments that are not great against the charges, when we would think that that would be his focus? I take it to be that he has other goals. But suffice it to say for now, he doesn't seem to fear death. He just kind of pays brief lip service to the charges and then really gets into what his activity is and why it's a good thing. He does other things, like he taunts his accusers. When asked what his punishment should be, I mean, death is on the table. That's what Meletus argues that he should get. Socrates instead proposes that he should get free meals for life. If his main goal was acquittal, and if he was trying to avoid death at all costs, he wouldn't suggest that as the only alternative punishment, right? He says he's not going to appeal to the judge's feelings, although interestingly he does bring up his family in that regard. He compares himself to a gadfly. Flies, you want to kill flies. Why is he putting this idea in the mind of the judges, that he's annoying, the kind of annoying that you would want to kill? It's almost like he corners the court. He gives them almost no option but to put him to death. When they come back with the ruling that he's guilty, and they talk about the vote total, Socrates is kind of surprised. He's like, oh man, I thought you guys would all vote against me. I can't believe that so many voted in my favor. And then when asked what sentence to propose, again, he proposes free meals for life. He seems to not care at all, or be generally unconcerned that he's about to die, and that's what's on the line here. Or at least part of what's on the line here, right? Socrates, it seems to maybe have other goals. So is he living up to his values here? He claims that it's cowardly, unwise, and arrogant to fear death. He is so unconcerned with death. He might as well be one of those Homeric heroes who welcome death for the sake of glory. In fact, he brings them up on one occasion at least. And other things he values. He claims that one should not value wealth, social status, reputation among the common and even the powerful, the comfort of yourself and your family, or even life itself above a pursuit of truth. So to support this, or to how he lives it, how he demonstrates it, in his life, he takes no payment for his services. He probably could be wealthy because there's so many wealthy young people who want to learn from him. He seeks no office, so doesn't seek to social climb, and he harasses the powerful until they kill him. He seems to be totally unconcerned with what people will think of him, except for those maybe who he's trying to reach, and those who have good judgment. So those who have good judgment, he seems concerned with their judgment, but the reputation among common people and even the powerful, he seems totally unconcerned with. And then the comfort of himself and his family. At the end of the dialogue, there's a striking, I mean, as a relatively new parent, there's a striking paragraph where Socrates says, please do me this favor. After I die, harass my sons in the same way that I've been harassing all the powerful people in the city, and make sure that they're living a life how they should, according to virtue, and not chasing after all this other stuff. The fact that he would suggest that people harass his sons is remarkable, and shows that the comfort of he doesn't value the comfort of himself, the comfort of his fellow citizens, the comfort of his family, at all when it compares to seeking the truth and living a good, virtuous life, valuing the right sort of things. So what are Socrates' goals then, if it's not his acquittal? It seems one of his primary goals is explaining what philosophy is, both in his example, how he lived his life, what sort of activity he was engaged in, what it's not, like what the sophists were doing. Another goal is explaining how by practicing philosophy, he's living the sort of life that should be lived. So not just what it is and what his activity is, but justifying it. It's like he's defending philosophy here. He's not defending his own life, at least with anything like the gusto that he's defending philosophy. And maybe he's even martyring himself for the glory of philosophy. I mean, he is shocked that anybody's voting that he's not guilty. He sort of corners the jury or his judges into executing him, giving them really no other option, either reward or execution. And if he's already guilty, they're probably going to go execution, right? He certainly wants to take some shots at his detractors. He wants to steamroll Miletus and all the people who are against him. His own acquittal, maybe it's a goal, but certainly way down the list and seems to be almost an afterthought. Why is this so impressive? I mean, Socrates, his life is on the line here, and his life, his reputation, and what does he do? He stands up for exactly what he believes in, even though he knows that that will lead to his death. He believes that that will lead to philosophy being continued amongst other people. It's like, strike me down and you'll only make me stronger sort of thing. And how unflinching he is in the face of his own death, and how he lives his values right up to the end, I think is one of the more powerful features of this story, if not the most powerful. All right, so a couple more quiz questions. Quiz question number 3. What conception of piety emerges from Socrates' story about the oracle? So this is continuing on from the 2 quiz questions on the previous video. What conception of piety emerges from Socrates' story about the oracle? A, unquestioning devotion. B, ruthless interrogation of the god's words. Or C, adhering to religious traditions. Quiz question 4. On my interpretation, why does Socrates scantly and poorly argue against the charges against him? A, his primary concern is not being acquitted. B, he doesn't know how to produce good arguments. Or C, he's too nervous in front of such an assembly. All right. Remember to take notes about those, because the answers are only in the lecture, not in the quizzes. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this talk about Socrates' idea of virtue and what I interpret his goals to be throughout the dialogue.